we go. Greetings, gamers, and welcome to the 30-second live stream from the Misfit Gamer Studios. I'm your host, Vortex, and this is D&D Discussions. Today, I'm actually really interested in our topic because it is going to be the first, hopefully, of several deep dives into the origins of High Point. Specifically, not just where I came up with the idea of High Point, but the in-game origins of High Point and a lot of its structure. And we've already gone over things like how I've, done my own magic classes and kind of done my own things with High Point. We've talked about that I have physics and that I have aspects of High Point that are outside of just the standard D&D book, which is, why we do the homebrew reviews the way we do and discuss, the transitions that would have to be made in order for things like that to work in High Point. But I have realized that overall this time I haven't done a whole lot of discussing, what High Point is and really, where it came from, where I got the ideas and why I run it the way that I do. So I thought that would be a good series to do, whether I'm doing it from every Thursday from here on out or just on Thursdays when I don't have another topic. But I really do just want to talk a little bit more about what I've created, why it is the way that it is, at least until we can get gaming in it and show you what gaming is like with me as a DM. At least I can kind of give you some background on the world that everyone's living in and all of my players are playing in. Now, the difficult part about that is, of course, I've been struggling all day with this, is where do I even start? And that's my biggest issue. Hang on a second, guys. Oh, that is not good. That's better. I'm trying to find like a good... okay, give me one sec to do camera stuff. Come on. Okay. Are we good? Maybe a bit of a zoom out there. Don't really need that much, but looks a little better, I guess. All right, so, realistically, I haven't really talked about my realm, and I really haven't talked about what it actually that runs it. So I do want to just start doing deep dives, but the biggest problem I always have when I come across this topic, it's something that I always want to talk about with people, and I'm happy to answer questions on. But when I want to sit down and actually do a full discussion for the stream, I have the problem with, most topics. Where do I begin? Where is a good spot to even start? And what is actually of interest to other people? Obviously, I just want to talk all day about my realm and all the cool stuff that I've thought of, that I've done, that I've planned, that I've written. But what it comes down to is what is necessary for not just my audience, but for my players. Because this is something that, as a DM, I've struggled with before. So not just trying to discuss it from the point of view of a stream, as in a podcast, and trying to talk to you, the viewers, and make it interesting. But when I have new players, or when I want to develop my current players, I always struggle with knowing how much information to give my players themselves, not just the characters, because they're going to get stuff as they game and throughout the game and in-game. They'll get all of that. But I always struggle knowing how much and what to give to my players to keep them enticed and to keep them going without giving them information that I feel, is not really spoilery, but there's some things I want to keep necessary to figure out in-game, obviously plot points and, details about NPCs and things. But I also struggle sometimes with keeping too much back and not really giving everybody like reasons to go out and explore and find out, what else there is other than, whatever it is they're currently campaigning on. And same thing with this, talking about the origins of High Point. is like I could talk about, you know, the birthing of when I created it and the first trial runs that I did with it. I could talk about the in-game origins of it and the things that Zenith had to go through, and what he did in order to get to this place and create it the way he has done it. I can just talk simply about after its creation and what I believe led up, basically kind of like more like a history of High Point. Or in terms of origin, I guess you could also, you know, encompass that into like what are the foundations? You know, why do I choose second edition as the foundation, and then what other parts of other editions do I use? So that's kind of a lot of topics, and I would love to cover all of them, but I'm not that organized. I'm not that scripted, and frankly, I don't know if and what all of that is entertaining. But at the same time, I also understand that the entertainment comes from, you know, whether or not I'm enjoying, you know, actually being able to, and whether I'm enjoying talking about it and being able to talk about it. So those are two things that are just the constants that I'm running into in terms of this particular topic. I've wanted to start this topic like 2 months ago, actually. Surprisingly enough, I have tried my hardest. I don't know why it keeps going out of focus. I've tried my hardest to revisit this topic and get it on the books, but every time it comes up, I really just can't choose a good starting point, and I don't know how much, you know, really to give out. But it's come to a point to where I know that I do just need to start talking about it, and I want to start talking about it, and I don't think I'm going to make that decision anytime soon. So I kind of just put it on the books last Monday. I think I've just been kind of hyping myself up that I'm going to be talking about this. So yeah, this is probably going to be more of a rambling type of stream today. I'm probably going to be all over the place in terms of what I'm talking about. I may not have any clean direction or very specific topic when I talk about the origins, but I'm going to kind of give a bunch of high level stuff. And I think what I'm going to do is see what sticks, see what you guys are interested in, see what questions come up, and also to see just what I typically rant more about. Because if I sit there and find out that, you know, I'm rambling more about, you know, the history, you know, the actual like history unfolding once High Point was created, if I start to ramble more about that, then, you know, that might be the deep dive, you know, going into all of the eras that I have in the history of High Point, and basically all the phases that it went through. But we might get caught more up in the actual origins of how High Point was created, both, you know, in game and out of game, which has nothing to do with that particular history. So yeah, I don't know. I'm just gonna kind of start rambling about it, and we're gonna find out where we you know. Which topics we cover, and we'll see how many more deep dives I can do. My camera's really bugging me. I don't know if it is for you guys, but I just feel like my camera's really out of focus right now. What's going on, Cosmic? What do you find more amusing about your session yesterday? How you killed the Hydra, or the Archdevil being 1 HP? I think the more amusing part is how you killed the Hydra. The idea that you were able to target the heart with Shatter and basically just end it there was probably the most amusing part, especially both as an in-game action and as a narrative. The Archdevil being at 1 hit point is definitely a meme moment, and I think that's fantastic, and I would love to have been there for that. But I'm actually more impressed that an Archdevil was used, let alone that it was at 1 HP. But yeah, no, how you killed the Hydra, fantastic. Cosmic, does the camera seem bad to you today? Does my camera seem out of focus at all? It's, you know, I know I normally use this angle when I'm doing my pop-up games, and I have the camera a lot smaller, so I think maybe it's just me. But you're pretty much here every stream. I can't tell if the camera is just out of focus or if it's just because it's blown up, and it's not usually blown up in this angle. Because normally on Mondays when Kage's here, the camera's like right here for me. So I'm a little bit closer to it. This one's behind my monitors. You're multitasking between here and Genshin. Oh, hey, someone joined your world. Nice. All right, well, you have fun with Genshin. If you have any questions, let me know. But yeah, I think we're just going to get into it. I think my camera is just autofocusing, so we're just going to have to kind of deal with that, and we'll see what happens. Hopefully, I'm hoping next year, maybe around March, I'll be able to get an actual, like, legit camera and be all fancy, like, look like a real streamer and all of that. But we'll see. It's either going to be that or a new computer. I'm not sure which one I'm going to get first, but we'll find out. So I have some old school notes here. I have some of my very first notes from when I made High Point here. It's kind of crazy to look back on just like the things I thought were worth taking notes on. I'm not a big note man. I'm not a big note guy. In school, in life, I don't take notes. I will take notes if I want to remember something more, because physically writing it down does help me remember. But the idea of going back on notes, unless it's a write-up, more like unless it's something like a reference, I don't go back to notes. No, more times than not, if I go back to notes after too long, I don't even remember or have any concept of what I was trying to make notes on, because I make notes in the moment I'm bad at notes. So hey, if you can use notes as a DM, more power to you. Take as many notes as you can. But if you're like me, broad notes. Take very broad. No, I like the way that my memory works. I like to take large bullet point notes that I know will lead me in a certain direction of thought. And I like to call it like the domino effect. So I like my notes to basically be the trigger domino, to where as I'm reading the note, by the time I'm done with it, I've hit those first couple dominoes, and the rest of it, kind of comes forth and go, okay, now I remember what I'm doing. Because I can't take extensive notes in the moment, because I'm either going to lose my idea, or I just get overwhelmed. I just taking there just would be too much to take notes on. So the idea of being able to trigger a remembrance of those ideas is usually how I like to take notes. So big, broad notes. Get big topics with a couple things that will help trigger it. So whether that's a couple sentences or just some bullet points that get more detailed. But yeah, I know I'm not a huge fan of like pages and pages and stacks and notebooks, because I can't keep track of it. That's not. I mean, I could probably sit down, write out all my encounters, write out all my details, write out all the things that I want to do. But in the end, the number one problem I would have is not the fact of writing them. My number one problem would be going back to them. And that's not just because I won't want to and I won't have time, but imagine I have I have a handful of notes that I can keep organized. But if I have a notebook of notes, the idea of having to figure out what page to then go read all of that information, that's doubly more what I'm bad at, is that kind of organization. So again, broad notes and keeping things together. I have like small notes that are all packaged together for the areas of my game that they're in. So I have a note pile, or not a note pile, but I have a notebook full of mini sections of notes for one of my gaming groups, and the same thing for another one, and then a personal one like this. I have like little tiny things like this that it's like a little tiny one page, but this reminds me of a lot going on in my realm. But that's just how I have to work. Yeah, it is noteworthy that I am not a note guy. But that's another thing where I also believe that this is something, a benefit to being a DM, is once you get to that point, you can really, and I don't want to say abuse this, but you can rely a lot on your players for those minute notes. Having a strict rule, like my DM had this, and I've adopted this rule pretty standard as well, is the concept that if it isn't written down, it doesn't exist. And the idea is that, if you get something, a special item, you meet someone, if it's that important, you want to at least make some sort of note, so that I will at least, be on the same page, because I'm not going to remember every single thing I throw at my players, right? That's one of the bigger difficulties as a DM, is to remember yourself all of the conversations, all of the details you've given out. It's easier to a player who heard it, interacted with it, and then that's been on their mind. But for you, DMs have been constantly churning out all of that information. So leaning on your players to take good notes, having rules in there that, you have a rule or a concept of, hey, who's taking notes? Even asking that, like, hey, are any of you taking notes about this? Convincing them that writing people's names down is a good thing, whether you met them, or just telling them that, if you don't write it down, it may not, come up in the future. Like, you can't just say, oh, that guy gave me that item. And it's like, well, why didn't you write it down? So those kind of things really help. And when you get your players really into that, it does really help you get triggered in your memories, because they'll be able to bring it up, and they'll most likely be able to, write down a note like, oh, yeah, remember when we met that guy? It was this gaming session. And then you can go, yes, I remember that when that one happened. And that would help, align with your own notes if you're taking any. This is also why at the beginning of gaming sessions, I think I've mentioned this long ago in one of my first streams, but one of the things that I like to do in the beginning of my sessions is ask my players to do the recap. So instead of me sitting down and giving a summary of what happened last gaming session, what I like to do is ask my players, so who wants to recap? And or I'll just say, so what do we remember from last game? And I'll just be like, hey, so Kage, what do you remember from last game? And then Vixie, what do you remember from last game? And they'll take their accounts, and I'll either correct anything that they got wrong, or that they might have off, and I'll interject things that, it's like my reward to them. It's like, if they're remembering the right things, if they're trying, to get in the mindset, I'll be like, yes, and remember, he insulted you. Like, so getting them back into their character, getting them back into their mood sets, are things that I'll try without just directly doing all the work. And this also, I feel, encourages, the players. Now, it's not gonna help if they're not interested in the story, but it encourages those that are interested to, keep a hold of those, ideas, especially after long gaming periods. It also helps that if they know that they're going to be recapping the game, it reinforces the idea that they should be taking notes as well. Again, with all the other ideas that you tell them of, hey, is someone going to take notes this time? And again, even just asking that as a DM, even just right as the game begins, or even after the game has begun, nothing's really happened. But once something really significant happens, you meet someone, they get some good information, a battle just ended, just throwing it out there, be like, oh, hey, by the way, so you just met that person. That's great. You guys are going to go out over here. By the way, is anyone taking notes? Did anyone want to write this down before we continue? And that's a great way to subtly, because again, everyone's in the game, everyone's playing, they're rolling the dice, they're thinking about their character, they're in character, but dropping that little hint right there of, hey, does anybody want to write something down? Does anybody want to, take advantage of this moment? It will kind of pop them back into that mindset of, oh yeah, this is important and I'm in the mood right now, I'm in the moment, but I'm not going to remember what we just did or who we just talked to. So doing that again is a great way to not only get that participation from your players, but especially if it's a moment that you'll want to remember, throwing that in there and getting at least someone to write a little note is really worth it. Man, why can't you just stay? I wonder if there's a way that I can't tell it from here to not autofocus. It won't just stop autofocusing. I have to go to the app itself on the thing, but the way that it's mounted is just terrible. Oh well, we're gonna deal with it. All right, so I guess that was a little little extra advice for DMs out there. But yeah, using players for notes is a worthwhile idea. Okay, so high point. I don't even know where to begin, so I guess we'll just kind of start with a broad scope of where I got the idea, and then we'll just kind of dive into different sections of it, and we'll just see what sticks. So I started devising the idea of high point probably 8 years ago, I want to say 8 or 9 years ago at this point. I had the interest of being a DM about a year or so into my hardcore playing era. And when I say hardcore playing area, I mean I was gaming, doing multiple gaming sessions a week. At the height of it, I was going over to my DM's place almost every weekend, and I would go there Friday night, not leave till Sunday, and sleep was scarce. I mean, it was basically just all we did. I did this for, I think, like a solid 2 years, 3 years. We just gamed the crap out of everything. I mean, this is where he introduced me to every layer of it. We played chainmail, we played first edition, second edition primarily. He did incorporate a lot of third edition and Forgotten Realms, and then never touched fifth edition or fourth edition with him at all. It was all third or before. He was primarily gaming in second edition, which, let's face it, that's where I got the primary of my love for it. It was the first edition I was really introduced to. It's the one that I learned and that became just kind of what I knew as D&D, right? So it's not that I see 5e and think, oh, that's not D&D. You don't know what you're doing anymore. But when you say Dungeons and Dragons, right? When you say that, that's what comes to mind as second edition for me. That's just where my mind goes. There's a lot of people who, when you say video games, some people are going to go to shooters. Some people's minds go straight to co-op. Some people's minds go to the Wii, for all of those games, because that was all they, maybe that's the only video games they ever did. Maybe some people only ever think of arcade games. That's where I mean by, like, in the end, whether or not the other editions have better aspects to them, second edition is just where I know the most, where I feel the most comfortable. And to be fair, even to those that I've talked to that aren't a huge fan, and let's face it, most people aren't a huge fan of second edition, there is a strong argument to be made that second edition is one of the easiest editions to expand upon. And what I mean by that is really utilizing the mindset that was originally created with Dungeons and Dragons back before AD&D, back when it was just Dungeons and Dragons. And first edition, the idea that these were just rule sets, these were just guidelines, these were a foundation for a group of friends to take and build a story, a narrative, and a role-playing game based off of just some fundamental ideas. And I think that's it was a big deal, I think, and a big changer for me to have been introduced to Dungeons and Dragons the way that I was. All those years ago when I was a child, having, I talked about this in my introductions episode way back when, talking about my history. But, the very first introduction I had with D&D was, purely someone just describing the game to me. And after so many years, finding a DM who really fit that narrative and really showed me how to play the D&D that I always imagined. And that's, I think, just really what stuck with me, is the fact that D&D was never supposed to be this extremely structured, and I don't want to say by the book in terms of like raw and rules as written. What I mean by, like, it just, D&D from its fundamental creations was always meant to be an imaginative game, and these were, because it was so new, these were the books and the editions were the foundations to help spur the imagination of people and build upon that. But of course, it is a company, it wants to make money, and it wants to expand its ideas, right? Because you get to a point to where so many people like something, but not everybody can, build it from the ground up. So they do expect more from you. They want more ideas. They want things to come to life more, and they do want more guidelines. And that's where you start to get to that point to where you do have that split. You have the entire, well, I don't even want to call it a split anymore. At this point, I mean, a spectrum or a range does make more sense, because you have, all the extremes, everything from, once you learn it, you should just homebrew everything because you know it all. And then it's the other extreme of, it's purely by the book, word for word, and, you don't go outside of it. And then there's everything in between, of course. And, I think that really shaped the way that I approach my DMing, is having the understanding that, originally it was put forth as your imagination comes first. This is here just to fuel it. And so that was a big push early on when I was a gamer and a player in my DM's realm. The big push to want to be the creator of this narrative, the creator of these stories. I was so fascinated with the way that my DM really created his world. It was fascinating to me the way that he was able to weave the story in such a well-built world that, only existed to him. Something that he had taken years and years playing with his friends and family to build and to have, this lustrous background. And for us to be able to work with it, manipulate it, and live within it, and just to watch how he took what we did, and it was, it was just so much more than talking to somebody and then getting into a fight, rolling dice, and then saying that we're somewhere else. There was so much more manualness to it, and I do see the turn off to that for a lot of people, but for me it was great. And to set me up to be a DM, he inspired me in so many different ways, because over time, it started to become this almost creative battle. Once we got good enough as players in his very creative world, it really became a battle of, can we now outthink you? Can we use the tools you've given us to now turn them on you? And that game right there, beyond the characters, beyond the dice, the game of wits with the DM is really where I started to get addicted. And I think that's just that 2-3 years that I spent just purely playing D&D all the time. That's what fueled me, and that's what constantly got me to want to make my own world, because of the puzzle, because of the idea that I wanted to make something that was impenetrable, something I want, just like what we were doing with my DM's realm when we were trying to test it and manipulate it and play with it. I wanted to make something that somebody else could do that with. So I started the idea of wanting to be a DM, and it's the very first thing I ever really created, the official, I guess you could say, origins of High Point, was basically like a town. Started with a simple town, had some ruins just on the outside of town, and it was kind of a desolate place. Didn't really have a whole lot going on for it. It was a much bigger idea than I needed to start out with. I wasn't even trying to DM anything. It was more like one of my peers, one of the other players, we had sat down on a weekend when it's on some downtime, and we kind of just messed around with almost just playing around with an idea that I had of this town, having them walk around it and me kind of narrate and DM a little bit. And nothing really came of it. I think I did 2 or 3 sessions, I think 1 or 2 with him, 1 session with somebody else. And I realized that, it was very difficult to be interesting and creative while also allowing the person to explore something that, feels real, right? It was just, I learned that being a DM in that moment, it was just my very first attempt at narrating and DMing. And I realized that, it's not as easy as it seems. You really have to not just have an idea, but you have to have walked through the idea. It's one day to say, oh, I have a town, it has a market if they want to go there. But it's different than saying, okay, well, let's walk to the front of town. What would be here? And then let me walk through town. What would be on the way to the market? Doing that as a DM to kind of flesh it out, to kind of feel what the players would do, is a lot different than saying, I have a town with a market, and it also has a docks, and it also has a cemetery. It's because that's playing from the mindset of players go there, they ask where to go, and you say, yes, I have one of those, you're there now. Whereas some players are going to be like, oh, cool, so we're going to go to the front of town. And then you're like, you're at the front of town. There's that disconnect of, well, like, what do we see? Like, so that those were the very origins of me learning how to do that. Now, I don't really consider that the official high point setting, but I do consider that the seed. That was the seed that was planted because I worked on that idea to a point to where I eventually collapsed it. Eventually just basically said, yeah, that's not going to work at all. But at the same token, I dropped that idea before any of my player characters had actually ascended to godhood. And technically, when my my very first character ever finally ascended to godhood, that's the official starting point of high point. So this was the seed in my mind of when I really wanted to start to be a DM. But what's fascinating about that little seed, ironically that interesting. So in that seed of an idea, I had a lot of the precursors that still exist today in High Point. And what's also funny is there is technically a magical item that existed. There's only one of them that existed in that very first seedling universe. And it does still exist today in High Point, which is by technicality why there is a link to this little thing in High Point, but it's, without getting too pedantic and off topic, it's kind of more of a temporal thing. It's more of a, that was the seedling of High Point in me, the player, but after my character ascends and the official origins of High Point begin, it's more like if this little pocket, seedling universe is over here and this is the progress of High Point, at some point High Point kind of warps and manipulates to touch that. Hard to explain, but it does make sense in the way that in the way that High Point was created, it would make sense. I'm just not explaining it well because it's a concept that doesn't really have a good explanation. But the seed of High Point, although it came before High Point, temporally came after, but High Point made it exist before it existed. Yeah, High Point's weird. But it makes sense if we get into other topics later. So I will try to hopefully remember to circle back on that because it's again, if you guys have heard me before talk about it, nothing just happens because it happens. It all has a purpose. It's just whether or not I have the right words to explain it in the situation, because depending on the context that we're talking about it could mean that I would have a different way of explaining it. And I don't know if that makes any more sense, but I'm going to continue the topic anyway, because I said I have other things that will explain with the origins of High Point that will tie back to the temporal wonkiness that is this little pocket seed of what was High Point. So after doing that, and after getting a taste of it, but continuing to game with my DM and slowly learning that I really did want to try my hand eventually at DMing, over time, my character ascends, and he ascends to godhood. And within that godhood, he's in my DM's realm, and he's basically gifted his own infinite pocket universe. And that pocket universe, was my DM's way of basically saying like, hey, you're up to this point. You've gamed with me a long time. You've gotten to the point of, basically becoming a god. We can redo new characters. You can kind of keep playing as a god. But it was also a way for, kind of like an opportunity to now start to develop my own ideas of how to be a DM, and both in and out of game. But it was kind of like a benchmarking, right? So I've gotten to that point. Now he was more along the lines of, hey, if you want to start trying to be a DM, I'll work with you on it. And this was kind of like, the in-game reasoning why. So the Pocket Universe was essentially a way for my in-game character to start creating something that was livable, and then working with my DM eventually with like, what he would do is anybody who got to a certain point with, their god, and they created their little area, he would let them run a DMing session. Like he would let them run a D&D session in their little thing. So he would work with them. He would work with all of us, let us create our own little worlds, our own little pockets, and kind of create all the details. He would work with us on, what details would be needed to really create something that could be gamed in, do all the little fine tuning. And then once we had that and a story and an understanding, he would then, put aside, one of the gaming sessions for us to come over. Everybody would create a new character. And then we would run a small gaming session in that person's realm or in that person's little pocket. So that was always fun. I thought that was a great way for the benchmarking system. I mean, it took me forever to do that. And he was a little bit of a gatekeeper on it in terms of, when you could basically do it. But it wasn't necessary. I took what I could get, and I learned a lot from it. But it was during that I started to really develop the very beginnings of what High Point is today. It started out as I wanted to start High Point originally as a duality system. Not duality system, almost like a bi-dimensional system. And what I mean by that is I wanted it to be a place where you had a functional blending society system, almost like around a spire or a mountain, like a great mountain. And then all around the base of the mountain are like the various different origins of different races and creatures and everything, and the concentrations of themselves. And I had them all kind of grouped up to where you would have the most blending. But of course there would be the areas where they overlapped, where there'd be a lot of overlap. And then of course there would be chunks of just big melting pots where many of them moved around. But it was kind of this cool, concept of like the origin of like an origin mountain, or an origin of the region of where everybody came from. But one thing I also wanted to incorporate into this was an idea from one of my favorite book series called the Apprentice Adept series from an author named Piers Anthony. Now, in this series, such a great series. It is the true definition of sci-fi fantasy. You have a main character, starts off in a advanced futuristic technological world, and he goes about attempting to increase his status in his world, gain fame and fortune. And at one point, he discovers an oddity, an anomaly on his planet, that allows him to basically be transported to an identical planet, but and it's identical in almost every way, except, of course, his planet is in the future. It's a dead planet. They live in biodomes. It's very technological. And then this identical planet is the opposite. It's lush. It's green. There's air. Everybody lives outside. It's archaic. There's, stone and wood buildings. There's not these, advanced biodomes. There's no vehicles. There's no real technology. And of course, being true sci-fi fantasy, there's magic here. So in one world, it's pure science. In this world, it's pure magic. And he goes about, discovering this new world in the series, eventually learns that he can go back and forth, and it progresses from there, learning, what his destiny on both sides are, and I won't give anything else away. But that's basically like the general premise of it is the main hero finds himself between two different worlds and has to find his place among both. And that's kind of what I wanted for the original High Point. Before it wasn't even called High Point. I didn't even have a name for it at this point. But Zenith's World, the one I wanted to do was I wanted it to have this aspect. And the idea, the origin of this aspect was actually something that was going on with the character before he became a god. Right before he became a god, actually. He had gone through, my main character had gone through a pretty intense situation. Crazy. he was adventuring with another one of the party, and they had, I think, a ring of wishes that had one wish left. And he had done one of those dumb things where he said a wish that's like a very Jin type wish, where it could be very easily modified. And so what had ended up happening was we were fighting, I think, wyverns. I think we were fighting a group of wyverns, and we killed, I think, most of them, and one was fleeing, and we couldn't quite catch up to it. So he used the spell real quick and without thinking, and this is the player and character, but without thinking at all, he just pulls out the ring and says, "I wish we were at the last wyvern." And my DM just looks at him and goes, "That's what you say?" And he goes, "Yep." And I'm just like, and I can't do anything about it because I wouldn't be able to stop him. And my DM just smiles and says, "Okay." And then he describes what happens next. So of course, in the player's mind, in my buddy's mind, we were fighting a group of them. And so his wish was to bring us to the one that was fleeing, that last one. But what he wished for was to bring us to the last wyvern. And that particular last wyvern happened to be very, very, very far in the future. I mean, I don't know how far, but I know it was pretty far. And the reason I know it was pretty far is because we were in... I don't remember the exact, all the details, but I do remember that we ended up in what essentially would amount to like a very futuristic zoo, like a very concrete with just glass and a box zoo, because when, the spell went off, we appeared in front of a very old, very bad-looking wyvern that was chained up, and we found ourselves in this box. And as we turned around, there was a giant thing of glass with people on the other side. And then they would hold up little like boxes and flashes would happen and blind us. So that kind of a future. And then, of course, get detained because we're suddenly inside of a zoo pen. Anyway, long story short, someone that my character had known from before the wish, walks out, and I find out that he's kind of in charge of everything. And I also find out in this future that, because I knew this character had wanted this NPC had wanted this all along. So we come to find out that in this new future, magic doesn't exist. There is no more magic. It is all science-based. And we're pretty sure he's to blame. And back in our time, back before the Wish time, that was always what his intent was. His intent was... he thought magic was a crutch and wanted a world that didn't need magic. He wanted a world without the necessities of magic. He wanted a world where magic was left alone. I don't know all of his reasonings. I just know that he wanted a world without magic. Well, here we were. Him alive and well in a world without magic. We met a couple other people that we knew that no longer were as powerful or as great and mighty as they once were under his control. And that was very, very bad. And while we sat there and awaited our most likely inevitable end, because why would he want anybody who could possibly bring back the past, we were escorted to the side by some people. And of course, because we were a very, very big problem for the future, there was a few people who were able to get us out of there and send us back to our time. And that was very interesting because it really does highlight the extent that my DM would go to really highlight, the idea of actions and things. Because, of course, in his realm, that was a potential future. It wasn't the guaranteed future, but it was a potential future. But I like to play my character, and according to my character, there's no such thing as potential futures. According to my character, as of that moment, that is the current future, and that's not a good thing. He doesn't necessarily believe that it will guaranteed happen, but he doesn't necessarily believe that that's one of many. He looks at it as if everything continues to go as is, that's happening, and he's the only one who knows it's happening. So that's my character comes back from this. So we get sent back right back where we left. I get pissed and threaten my the character again. Basically, take a dagger to his neck and say, "If you ever don't ever," or basically just like, "Don't ever include me in that again, or in any wish again." But that was a fundamental change for my mortal character. So again, this is before I became a god, but that was a fundamental change. Seeing that future again from my character's point of view, he understands that the future is unwritten. But having been there, having seen it, having lived it, as far as he knows, that is the current trajectory, and he's the only one who knows it. And in that exact moment, he basically did like an oath. He vowed from that moment forward, everything that he does, his entire purpose is now to prevent that future. Because he just saw a future of without magic, and to him that was unacceptable. To him, magic was one of the purest aspects of life, and to have it removed was unacceptable. So that character, this is Dice, by the way. I don't know if I've mentioned Dice before, but this is my very first character. So at that moment, Dice had made an oath, a vow, to stop that from happening. No matter what the cost, he would prevent that from happening. So fast forward to him wanting to make his own world. And of course, he still has this vow from his mortalhood. Now he's a god. And now he has the opportunity to potentially stop that from happening. So he starts wanting to, get some allies. He starts gathering some forces and people to make sure that people are aware. And he wants to have the right friends involved. And one thing he wants to do is, now that he has this private pocket universe away from prying eyes, he wants to study his enemy. He wants to make sure that he wants to understand the difference and wants to make sure how to prevent this from happening. So the idea was, because I had this book series that I really liked, I was like, what if he uses his pocket dimension to secretly research the development of science? What if he creates all of this stuff and then secretly divides it in half and shoves that away in another pocket dimension inside of his own pocket dimension? And in that pocket dimension, he does exactly what the big bad guy, the other NPC is planning to do. But of course, these aren't real people. These are his own creations. These are just fictitious little creations. They're magical entities. They're not real, as of the fact that he's in a pocket dimension of his own, and he's basically getting to manipulate all of this. So it's like a simulation to him, right? It's a living simulation, but it's his energy. These things die, they go right back to him, and then he can recreate them, right? They don't, and technically nothing has to die in this world. So the idea was, he wanted to see, he did some tests, ran a bunch of generations until he got what he saw out there. So in his little pocket universe, he created until he got roughly the same output and same interaction as he sees with what's in the real world outside of his pocket dimension. So once he got that, then he divided them up, set them all back, basically reset the whole thing. You guys are now reset with magic, and you guys are now reset with science. And he ran those, and he ran them for millennia, and then he would just run them against pocket dimension, infinite time. He would run them in different scenarios. He would run them both from the ground up, from when they both have nothing. Then he would run them from the ground up, but with the prior knowledge. Then he would run them to where it was science, then into magic, then magic into science, and then, primarily requiring magic and then removing all magic and giving science, and then adding the two slowly together, and then having, basically he ran constant simulations, and that was the whole point of what he was doing. This still wasn't considered High Point. I still hadn't come up with the official realm name yet, but this was the seedling version, because this also acted as his afterlife. So whenever his real life followers died, they would come here and join the pool of basically the creatures that were doing this. So he would constantly have not only his creations, but then his followers would die from the real world. He'd be able to bring those souls in and add them to the mix and get their interactions. So his whole purpose during that was to understand what the other NPC, what the other god was up to, and trying to see if he could eventually figure out how he was going to do it. But in that time, there was some turmoil within the realm already, and Zenith got caught up in a lot of that. And with all of that happening, there was big transitions happening, and there was some fallouts with some of the gods with each other, and a lot of choices had to be made. And there was also some personal things going on with Zenith that had followed him through into godhood that was happening in his mortal life. So with all of that, Zenith was realizing that his research was being compromised, but he also probably wasn't gaining the support that he was going to need. And he also started to have a resentment towards the current powers that be, the current emperor of the realm. In game, he was basically starting to not really have a lot of faith in the direction that everything was going into. And part of that resentment was leading him to believe that maybe, although he still had this oath to not let this happen, he started to wonder if the inevitability of it happening here, whether or not that would necessarily be a bad thing. And whether or not having that happen, basically kind of letting that take over, undo the structure, and then him coming back to fix it could be a thing. But he was under a lot of a lot of influences and wasn't really sure what he wanted to do anymore. He knew that he never wanted to live in a world without magic. He knew that oath to prevent a future without magic, that was something that he didn't want to give up on. But at the same time, he wasn't as loyal as he once was to the realm that he came from. So with all of that, he started to do deep searches. He started to really push the bounds of what his powers within his little private realm could do. And this is really where the all of his creations and everything up until this point was leading up to officially what we now know as High Point. But again, High Point still was in its early development, but wasn't considered High Point. This was still everything built in the previous realm, in my DM's realm. But basically there was a short time where Zenith isolated himself, and he basically tried to push the limits of what his infinite, his little infinite pocket universe was. Quite literally attempting to search every corner of it, and understand and really push the limits of his powers, because he was gaining power all the time, but he, obviously could never overpower the emperor. And at the same time, he knew of a way out. He knew by stories, and he knew that leaving the emperor's place is possible. Now, the only one knows how to leave is the emperor themselves, and you have to basically get approval to leave. And that wasn't really looking likely for Zenith. So, part and partial due to how he became a god. So when he became a god, there was one crucial thing that was given by my DM. And it's a sense of knowledge. Once you ascend to godhood, the amount of knowledge you were given, he was very specific on. And that knowledge is essentially all of the knowledge up to this point, which included all of the history of the current realm, which includes a lot of the history of D&D, Forgotten Realms, and it includes a lot. He was very specific on how much it included. And so one thing as a player that I didn't know is, of course, that's a lot of information that my character knows, but I don't. So over time, I did a lot of digging. I started to really educate myself on what Zenith now knew. And a lot of that started to bring him to some conclusions. So we already knew that he could leave the Emperor's realm. And he already knew a lot about the history of things. So he started putting the puzzle pieces together, in the sense that He knew that the Emperor's Realm was a very special place, but he also knows that all places exist within the crystal spheres. There was that, that was still the basis for everything. And he understood the powers that be, because in my DM's realm, a lot of the primary gods from D&D exist. So, and he knew, with all of that, I got to know all of their history and everything. So I started to really look at the history, and I started to look at everything that was going on. And I found a couple unique bits. And of course, like all with things in D&D, it takes your own imagination, it takes your own creativity. But seeing as how me and my DM in the real world were starting to, grow distant, and we weren't going to be playing a lot, and I did want to, work on High Point. I wanted to become my own DM, and I really liked what I was creating there. So I wanted to, I wanted to find a way to justify, breaking out, and I wanted to find a way that really, also continued the journey that I was on, because I was really doing this research to become a better DM, right? I wanted to understand better about how the origins of D&D were created, the idea behind, how they had so many different places and all of the modules, and, learning about the crystal spheres, the phlogiston, learning about, the difference between realm space and wild space, the different types of crystal spheres, and, how the world was created by the ancients, the fact that it was flooded by the phlogiston, and then the crystal spheres were like basically the protection spaces. So with all of that, Zenith started to learn and understand the concept that leaving this world, leaving his Emperor's world, was really just a sense of leaving that crystal sphere. However you have to do it, but each one's different, each one's unique, and there are spells that can protect egress and entrance to crystal spheres. So Zenith knew that he was up against basically every odd that he was probably not going to leave, and on the fact that he was basically in this little pocket dimension on top of that. But with a little bit of dumb luck, and also some, I guess you could say, hidden knowledge, because it's there, but it's, kind of like read between the lines a little bit, but the knowledge is there. At one point in time, there was a cataclysmic event that was actually caused by Mystara. Now, for anyone who's not familiar with Mystara's history, Mystara being one of the later versions of Mistral, and at one point, Mystara, I think it was the original Mystara, not Mistral, but the original first version of Mystara, was murdered. I can't remember the name of the god that killed her off the top of my head, but her death began what I believe are the Wailing Years, which was due to the spell plague. Now, in this, reading up a little bit more on this, you start to realize, I had a note here. It was Shar. Shar killed Mystara, assassinated Mystara. And that death of Mystara being, essentially the embodiment of the weave, the embodiment of everything that connects everything, that magical essence. The weave collapsed, and I believe that's what they ended up calling the spell plague, which the era of the spell plague known as the Wailing Years. And one of the key aspects that I always took away from that was they said that it was a cataclysm of multiversal proportions. So a lot of people can take that a lot of different ways. Didn't say multidimensional, didn't say multiplanal, multiversal. So looking at the idea of a multiverse, especially within D&D, right? There's a lot of different ways that you could take that. You could take that as in it goes just against the different planes of existence, it goes just through a couple of the different dimensions, or it just essentially affected the key places that were within that storyline of Forgotten Realms during the time. Or, however, do the D&D thing, because I highly believe that a lot of the vagueness of the history of D&D, the reasons of the ancients, the origins of phlogiston, the origins of the crystal spheres, I believe a lot of it was meant to be vague, not because they didn't finish writing it, but because that's the whole point of it. Remember, back in the original DMGs, they said these are just guidelines. Use them as bases, but take these and make your own stories. I think things were left vague not to create for later. I think things were left vague for the DMs to fill in the story. And I truly believe that. I think that this is why you have certain things unanswered, is because it's meant for us to make it make sense within the confines of our stories. If you want to, they don't talk about the ancients and who wrote all those things, because you're not meant to play back then. You're meant to play now. But those stories can be whatever you want them to be. You're just not meant to use them. They're meant to just be the grounds of a bigger story. And so when I think universal or multiversal, right? When you say a cataclysm of multiversal proportions. So my mind, again, and I've talked about this before, I'm a big advocate for using pop culture, especially for multiple reasons. Not just because it's fun, not just because everyone gets it. If you're using pop culture references, people are more likely to understand. They're more likely to get into it. Everyone's having a lot more fun, and it's imagination juice. Using pop culture helps the imagination flow. Now, I am a little bit against just straight out, flat out stealing the pop culture, just like one for wanting it, but using it to influence you. I absolutely believe that's great. I know it's a cliche of, I've stole every book and every TV show and every anime I've ever watched. I stole it and threw it in here. That's what D&D is, though, right? Otherwise, what are you gonna? All those people who are like, it's just a medieval game. Well, you only know medieval from the movies you watch. So realistically, everyone's doing that, right? But I'm big proponent, I'm a big advocate for throwing your pop culture references in there, because if it can help you remember and help the game be more spicy, it's going to make everyone have a lot more fun. And if it's references everyone else likes, it's going to work, right? So when you look at a cataclysm on a multiversal scale, my mind goes to something like the exploding TARDIS in Doctor Who. Right out the gate, that idea of the TARDIS exploding everywhere all at once, that is what I think of a cataclysm, right? So you're talking about the weave itself touches everything everywhere at all times, both past and future. So when Mystara was killed, like if you have the timeline, just because Mystara was killed here, that ripple effect, that cataclysm, she is the weave, and the weave doesn't exist just right here in the timeline. The weave is that timeline. So she dies here, and the weave itself, like a fabric that she's riding along, begins to unravel and fray everywhere at all times. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that all times were directly affected by spell plague, right? The past didn't have these same effects as spell plague as the future of it. But that ripple effect on a multiversal scale, in my opinion, means that it has touched past, future, and the what ifs, right? Multiversal. So I think of this as when you're having, because it went so far as to reshape things. Even D&D today is officially, supposedly, forever changed over this. And obviously there was a time frame where this had to have been taken care of. Now, most of the details of this, as far as I am aware, is that over time, this tapered off, the effects tapered off, and we eventually were left with what we have today. And there were several major events that happened to help balance some of the power back out. But it's never, I don't believe, fully explained in terms of like what was actually done. So this is where I start to be the creative, imaginative DM. And so I think, okay, you have this multiversal situation that happens just like the TARDIS. I look at it as just like the TARDIS. Something happened to where cracks begin to spread everywhere and every time. So I'm here in my pocket universe, trying a bunch of stuff, looking through all of the lore, and trying to find my way out of a crystal sphere. And what says that between dumb luck and me knowing what I'm looking for, I find a crack. Just a small one. But it's a crack caused by this cataclysm. Caused by Mystara dying and the weave shattering. And imagining, again, kind of taking my influence from Doctor Who, that just everywhere there would be cracks still visible, even though it was all technically in the D&D past. No matter where or when you are in D&D, there could technically be a crack. So let's say I came across this crack, figured out what it was. Essentially, I look at it as a crack between places, find out that, what's coming through isn't my world, isn't my pocket universe. What's coming through isn't the universe I know. It's something that is familiar, but not of anywhere I know. So what ends up happening is, I don't know for sure, Zenith doesn't find out for sure until after, but he draws a very strong conclusion that this is most likely due to that cataclysm, because it's the only thing that would make sense. It's the only cataclysm so powerful that could even potentially break through into his area, into his pocket universe, and could even affect the universe of the Emperor. So he makes preparations before interacting with it, because it could kill him. And he knows this, and he doesn't really care at this point. As far as he knows, he's here to rot. So he makes his preparations, gathering enough power to where he could separate himself, leaving behind a version of himself that was just powerful enough to continue to survive and will eventually regrow enough power to maintain his position. Because again, it's the kind of idea of he doesn't want his emperor coming looking for him, especially if he's able to escape, because he doesn't know where he's going and he may not want to come back. So the idea was he separates himself, makes kind of basically a version of himself that is kind of like a ticking time bomb, where it's like you're depowered, looks like you've just expended a lot of power, but you'll be able to regain it. But by the time you regain it, I'll be long gone. And then he put kind of a contingency where once you get to a certain amount of power, you'll essentially become your own entity. So essentially, he's really just kind of leaving a clone behind and moving on. But what he wanted to do was gather enough power that he could to make this potentially dangerous or life-threatening. I mean, he's God. He assumes that he's going to be able to do it, but crossing this veil, this cataclysmic crack in the fabric of everything, he's not sure what's going to happen. So he spends a lot of time, sends a lot of his clerics and his paladins and his holy warriors out doing missions, trying to gather as much things as he can in terms of faith power to store up, to take with him to survive this. And he does his best to make preparations in order to also close this crack on his way out, so he can't be followed. Now, whether or not he's 100% successful on that, he won't find out till later, but turns out that he was able to do it through verification through other people. So with that, he finally leaves. For the very first time, he leaves his emperor's realm and slips into this cataclysmic crack throughout everything. And where he finds out, so now the next part about this is really just, again, me taking a lot of different details from different aspects of Forgotten Realms and several different of the editions and modules, and piecing together a story that I would like. Doesn't necessarily, again, it points to a lot of known facts, kind of like, again, the Wailing Years, the death of Mystara, all of these things are known facts, but the specific details after he leaves are really, again, just more of where you get to, have fun with it. Again, this is an imaginative game, and I like where I took this story. So he finally goes through this crack and he leaves. Now, on the other side of this crack, he comes out obviously very weakened, but he finds himself, as far as he can tell, still within the confines of immortality. Now, he doesn't know where he is, so in terms of relationship on power, he may be still as powerful of a god as he was, but as far as he can tell, he knows the difference of at least what he knew as immortal and an immortal, and he still feels immortal. What he ends up finding, though, is he is in a fractured universe at this point. In this fractured universe, it's almost like a overlap location, a location where several types of universes and realms are overlapping. So it's very fractured, very interesting. But while here, he meets several notable people from history, from like D&D history. He actually gets to, because of how fractured it is, because this is all stemming from the Cataclysm. So this is kind of one of those ground zero locations where it has a lot of the most issues happening, but it's also going to be the focal point of everything completely being destroyed. And kind of like my idea of what happens in the background, where people are fighting to make sure that the whole of everything doesn't get destroyed because of the weave literally shattering apart. So in this little pocket universe where they are, this collapsing around them universe that's the multitude of overlaps, he ends up getting to prove himself and work with several notable characters regarding basically trying to save all of creation. Now, I don't try to make it into the fact that Zenith saved all of creation. I put it in the sense of he stumbled across people trying to do so, and in that attempted to help. So one thing that he learns with them, one thing I also really enjoyed about this is, again, trying to take a little bit more from the Doctor Who concept. It was really fun developing this playthrough for myself and developing this story, because I had a fun idea to actually have Mistral and one of the future Mistaras actually meet, because, again, fractured through all aspects of time and dimensions. That I really am squeezing on, or really writing hard on that multiversal cataclysm. But the idea was that he learned that the original Mistral, understanding the nature of the weave more than her predecessors, she knew of a way to fix the cracks. And with that, it takes quite a bit, but she found a way that she could fix cracks, so she just can't do it herself. So she needed everybody's help. And essentially what ended up happening, long story short, is that she needed gods to do it. So that's one of the reasons why Zenith was so lucky to be part of this, is because he had the ability to do this. Mortals could not handle it. But if you were a very powerful immortal or a god, you were able to basically handle this, to where her and a couple other high-powered gods at the time gave up some of their power to infuse a multitude of us. And we all essentially stepped into the schism, the actual, essentially the location that Mystara died. So it was the actual, physical schism across all planes of existence. So this crack was literally a hole everywhere. And that's why this little fractured dimension that we're all talking in and all hanging out and working our plans in exists, because the hole that was made in the weave when Mystara died made a schism in everything. So the closer you are to that hole, the closer you are to all of those overlaps, because that's where they all are touching technically. So by going into this, we all ended up having a situation where we had to eventually send parts of ourselves, but doing that took a lot of energy. So with the help of some of the more higher powered gods, we all got enough to be able to survive this. And essentially every time we would essentially kind of like what Zenith did before he left, create a version of yourself and send it out. And the idea was every time they did this, going through the schism itself would shred that entity. And each piece that it would shred into would be deposited to one of the many layers, or through one of the many cracks throughout all of existence. And by doing so in such a way, by not only entering it with a certain amount of power and then having a contingency once you exit, through a lot of complicatedness, they were able to close the schisms, or close the cracks behind them. Now, unfortunately, this led to a couple issues, because sometimes that would mean that your entity would be left behind. Other times, your entity would be able to be retrieved. So either way, the idea was that go into these, you would pop out, fix the hole there, and that entity part of you may be gone forever, or it may come back with whatever experience that it had gained. Now I'm going to take a little pin here. I want to side note here, because this is a really interesting detail that I had pointed out to Kage before. And I like this detail that I added into this story, because this purpose right here, the concept of that they had to go into this schism. If you've ever watched the entirety of the new series of Doctor Who, similar to how, if you think about how Clara Oswald jumped into the Doctor's timeline and was basically, that's why she was everywhere. Very, very similar to this. Now, I also use this very reason. This is the reason why I like this as my Zenith backstory, is because when I create a character in anybody else's realm, whether it's, in Discord or I go to somebody else's realm now, because ever since I put this into my story, every character I create, a new character that I create in someone's realm, especially if it's my first character, I always take on the name Pit Edcube. It's just always my go-to character name for a brand new character in a brand new realm. Pit Edcube. Now, the reason why it is, I'll even type that in chat just to give a thing. So Pit Edcube is a throwback to, once again, my Zenith's mortal character. So once upon a time, I ran into a female NPC as a mortal character, kind of saved her, did the whole romance thing, saved her in the middle of the woods, got to meet her family. We romanced, and eventually just kind of did the whole, fell in love with her, ended up getting married. And then my rival basically ruined our marriage, destroyed my life, blah, 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 D&D shit. But while I was courting her, basically while me and the NPC were early on, she invited me into her tribe, which they don't ever allow outsiders. I was a half elf. She was a full elf. They didn't usually allow outsiders, so it was a big deal. But when she introduced me to them in their language, she told me, what she helped translate. And she basically told them that in their language, there was no term for dice, like the idea of dice, rolling dice. That was his name. So that they didn't have a word for that because they don't gamble. And there was no thing for that. So the elven name that she gave them, that was his name in the tribe, was Pitted Cube, which is essentially what a dice is. It's a cube with pits in it. So his nickname in Elven for her and her tribe was Pitted Cube, which is basically just, dice. Then all that shit happened, right? Lost his wife to his rival. Wife didn't die or anything, but the rival made sure that the wife thought he was evil, and then basically she left him for somebody else. And then all of that happened. So, he was devastated in all of that. But this was, again, all before he ascended to godhood. So when he ascended to godhood, kind of left all of his mortal self behind, but remnants still remain, right? It's just kind of a thing. He was mortal once, and those are things that mattered to him. So when he did this and he pushed himself out there, he knew that essentially by doing this, he was going to, all those pieces were becoming mortal again. Like, he wasn't sending god versions of himself to these other worlds. They needed gods to be able to put enough energy to survive the schism to get to the other side. and at bare minimum, they would survive as mortals. So knowing that he was sending himself out and knowing that he was sending out versions that would become mortal, he was still Dice. Like deep down, he was still Dice, but he felt that, kind of as a remembrance of his past life, he wanted to kind of, immortalize that. And it's also kind of a memory of, do what you came here to do. Don't get sidetracked. Like there's a lot of reasons why Pitted Cube it just sticks with him. It's a memory of lessons learned and a memory of loss and a memory of being smarter. So I use that because that is also my semi justification for not only using Pitted Cube all the time, but it's also a fun way for me to think about it, because now whenever I create a character in someone's realm and I name them Pitted Cube, I kind of have a mindset that this is just one of those many places that I was sent to, or that I got sent to fix to fix the schism. And now that it's fixed, this is my character just stuck here. And of course, that character doesn't know. I don't play those characters as if they're Zenith here going, I'm here to save this world. They come here and they are just the character that is in there. But in my mind, that's their origin story, is they got basically zapped here to solve that problem. And that's just why I have all of, just why I like to use that name. And it just fits with this backstory. So while working with all of them and sending themselves out, because they would, have to get recharged, send out a new batch, and then just do this because they're just there. This is just one of the many things happening in order to basically protect the fabric of everything, right? The whaling years are happening because of the fallout of all of this, but this in my mind is more of a behind the scenes. All of the major gods are finally trying to fight to literally keep all of creation from shattering into nothingness. So as part of this, everybody basically wondered, what's going to happen if we succeed. Of course, there's the idea of like rewards and all of that. So Mistral, basically being as powerful as she was, basically wanted to know what everybody wanted, was willing to give everybody essentially a major gift. And Zenith had a very, very specific one. So this is where we get into some more interesting facts that we have to kind of, again, extrapolate from things that they've never officially confirmed, but you can extrapolate from reading. So he wanted more understanding because now he learned so much from them. Now, especially with them and all the time he spent with them, he was able, I use this to also infer how a lot of my reading as a player, and all of the research I've done with the history of D&D, this is also a great way that Zenith learned it all, because now he's with, some of the great legends to actually hear about what really happened. And with that, he always wanted to know what it would be like to be in a place that's not within a crystal. Like, he talked about whether or not it was possible to find a place outside of a crystal sphere, and it was essentially, even to all of the greats, not known. According to them, there is no such location. Once the phlogiston was created and flooded all known existence, the only safe place was the crystal spheres, and even to them, no one knows why the crystal spheres were officially created by the ancients. In High Point, there is a reason, but that's outside of this. I put that in High Point, but that's a different thing. But there was no known way to leave the crystal spheres. But Zenith had a plan, and he wanted to know if they would be willing to. Mystara agreed. So I forget. I have the notes somewhere else. I wasn't able to find it before stream, but between Mystara, Mistral, and one other character, they were able to do what he kind of wanted. And essentially, between all of the different places, he had learned of a place, I think it was Fairy Space. He had learned of a place where there was a tree, because he learned of the World Tree, which seemed to exist on multiple planes. And he also learned of Fairy Space, which had a mystical fairy tree that was so large that its roots actually grew into and disappeared at the bottom of the crystal sphere. And that always fascinated him because he knew that the Fae and certain others could use root systems of trees to travel. And he knew that there are things like the world tree that could exist in multiple places, and no one knew where this tree's roots went. People have gone outside the crystal sphere, and the roots are not there. And there's been no known crystal sphere found that have roots coming out from, just roots growing in. So Zenith thought, well, if we can't find where those roots go, many expeditions have attempted to, but they can't. But he is interested because he knows that with the crystal spheres, they typically only hold a certain amount of space. But we haven't found all of them yet. So with all of their help, he asked if they could do a expedition of themselves on a god tier level to search that fairy space tree, use the root system to see if they could actually plot where those roots go, and using the ability to travel through the roots, could they get there? So after everything was all said and done, what ended up happening was no one was sure they could find out where the roots went. That's still a mystery. Aside from that, they were able to figure out a new technique of traveling, however, between crystal skulls because of this, or crystal spheres. And with the cataclysm still happening and not quite done, not only could they travel from a few of the spheres, but some of the spheres seemed to be at different time frames too, like because the cataclysm was still connecting them somehow. But they weren't able to find the roots, and they weren't able to confirm an existence outside of a crystal sphere outside phlogiston. But over time, what they were able to find out was through a different technique, through another NPC who came in and gave different ideas, because once they learned that this was a good way to travel, they wanted to kind of map out some things. And somebody else had come in and suggested a way to where when they kind of find a new path to a new crystal sphere, they could essentially test how big the sphere was. They could kind of see, how big the space was, which would tell a lot about like how big the system was and what kind of sphere it was in the internal environment. So when all was said and done, Zenith wasn't able to get what he wanted, but there was one thing that he was offered. They said, hey, we can't get you the roots, we can't get you outside, but we might have found something that works. And they did point out that in one of the deepest corners that they could find, because crystal spheres are everywhere, but a very distant one, among a couple others that they found just almost by accident, they did note that there is a distant crystal sphere whose bounds were not measured or unmeasurable. So they touched it, they did a little ping, and they couldn't touch the crystal sphere. So the size was unknown. But they also found out that it almost seemed to be a dead sphere. There was a small anomaly. There was a small anomaly, but that was it. So, not really having any other options, having been freed, having helped, basically having been a small part in assisting in doing the saving the cataclysm. It finally came down to they had to close the schism. The fractured universe they were in would cease to exist. And essentially, they wanted to repair the schism because all the work that they did to close up the various cracks got to the point to where they'd be able to close this schism, all of the connecting realms would finally disperse. And that kind of like pop, all of them kind of springing back to their locations and back to not being overlapped and separated, would kind of do a cascade effect to help fix a lot of the damage, but not permanently, which is still what would lead to the spell plague, the wailing years, and everything as it always is. But this essentially would be a major reason for the reason why everything still does exist. So at the last minute, really thinking about it, instead of joining Mystara or joining any of the others on their escapades, Zenith decided to take the gamble. Now, what they did say was, once he goes, of course, this will be his last trip, and of course they guaranteed that they want the crack closed, which means once he goes, that's it. And unless he can find another way out and traverse the phlogiston, without the schism and without the crack, his technique of using the fairy tree or the fairy space tree and everything else wouldn't work anymore. So he took the leap of faith and he went by himself to this unknown, unmeasured crystal sphere. And when he arrived, he did what he needed to do. He closed the crack behind him, and he found himself in a void. And that, you could say, is the origins of High Point. Which is where you get the whole distortion, because technically this is where he created High Point as High Point. But we talked about that seed earlier of me attempting to DM and having some things that were holdovers, even though they were before Zenith's time. And that's where the cataclysm happens. The transition, not only of doing the cataclysm and fixing it, and having all of those fractured pieces go out. And like I said, some of the fractured pieces were lost for good. Once they closed the crack, those pieces were severed from him forever. And some weren't. Some miraculously came back after they were severed. And that's where, because the cataclysm touches everything, all space and time, anywhere and at all times, that seed of existence that's how I put it, as him transferring to this new location connected him to the pieces and to some of the ideas from that. And now that he is here in High Point, those initial seeded pieces are now ideas that he has for his current future. So High Point created these things beforehand. And some of the ideas aren't his, but they will come about. And this is kind of also the reason why I also have the starting of the prophecy, because now that, not only because of where he is, which we'll get into a minute of that anomaly will really play a part into the prophecies as well. But again, the cataclysm, the way he got here and how the cataclysm distorted everything is part and partial why coming here was very important, and how the beginnings of the prophecy began, because he now has ideas that he doesn't know are his and won't come from him, but will come from High Point. And they are sitting with him now, even though he doesn't know it. And again, this is just, instead of saying that I liked the idea, so I threw it in here, I always like having a reasoning. And the cataclysm, again, messed with everything. I mean, it was truthfully, everything changed during that cataclysm. If you haven't read up on the Wailing Years, definitely do so. It's really interesting. But he comes in here, and of course, after kind of figuring out how to traverse and how to be a god, because essentially that's what he is. I mean, he learns once he's here, he got beefed up enough to maintain his godlike powers, but instead of being in some pocket dimension universe owned by somebody else, he is in his own crystal sphere, void of everything but an anomaly. An anomaly at which that for the longest time he couldn't find. He was told there was one, but he actually didn't know how to find it. Once he was able to find it, he wasn't able to interact with it. In fact, as far as he could tell that there was an anomaly only by the fact that it didn't seem like there was anything, and he couldn't interact anything at all with it. But that anomaly would eventually become a major plot point in terms of how the realm works, and how the the prophecy of the realm works, because this anomaly is a byproduct of the cataclysm. It's not part of the crack anymore, but it is a byproduct of that cataclysm. And this is where, when I mentioned before, that book that we talked about, that I originally wanted to do that whole duality thing, that's where this is going to come in major play. So this kind of also explains why this particular crystal sphere is so large, larger than most others. Most others contain, if you read up on them, most crystal spheres contain a planetary system, so a solar system. This crystal sphere of High Point contains just larger than a galaxy. And the reason for that is this anomaly. So once he finds out how to interact with the anomaly, a lot of trial and error, he eventually is able to pass the veil of the anomaly in ways that even he still barely understands how he was able to do it, which is why it's not something that just anybody can do. But when he arrives, he realizes that he is transitioning quite literally into almost very similar to the cracks. He goes somewhere completely different. It's not just a new place. It is something in a completely different plane of existence and a different understanding of existence. And he lands on. He basically gets there. He lands. And where he finds himself is a place called Phase. Now, Phase is the fantasy side of the book that I mentioned earlier. Proton is the technological planet where our main character starts. Phase is the magical planet that he eventually finds himself on. So when Zenith passes this veil into this anomaly, he is transitioned to my D&D version of Phase. There he meets the main character from the book. Again, essentially the book series, after the third book, it's like 8 in the series. After the third book is when essentially my part takes place, but I don't interfere. I don't add myself or interfere with the series of the books. The first 3 books essentially have already happened to any of the characters that I interact with and that I use in my realm. And everything after it is essentially taking place either after or simultaneously with what's happening with my realm. But my realm is literally small interactions. I don't game here. This is just a piece of the realm that I have in the backstory that you can technically sort of come here and game. I don't know why my camera keeps doing this. You could just, come here and do that, but it's going to be very difficult. So it's more for the backstory. But Zenith comes here, meets the main character from the book. They have a bunch of stuff to talk about. Zenith learns a lot. But with this, Zenith learns about the transition of this place. He learns the transition from Phase to Proton. Even learns that he can cross the veil himself. And he does. He learns about Proton. He was fascinated about the idea because this was very similar to the idea that he had with his original place. Didn't work this way, but he had the idea of trying to do technology, but he didn't understand technology. So his version of technology never really gave him the ideas that he wanted. So this world is not only very foreign to him, but also is basically what he always wanted to try and test out. But he also feared it. But then he understood that it was locked away behind the veil, just as Phase was to it. So he found this fascinating. He stayed here for a while trying to learn the differences and understand technology. But he also learned that in Phase, no one had ever really considered, he's the first person to come to Phase from Phase, if that makes sense. I don't know. What is up with my camera? I got to turn off my autofocus on the camera. So what I mean by that is anyone was either born in Phase or you came from Proton. Zenith is the very first person in Phase's history to come from Phase but not be born in Phase. And essentially, he's the first person to come from the sky. And in fact, he has a long discussion with the main character, that the main character is one of the few people to ever consider what's beyond the sky. Most people who are born in phase never do, and only those that have come from proton have ever considered it. And the reason for that is when you're in proton, you're on a planet, and proton is a futuristic version of our solar system. So there is a planet Earth, but many, many centuries ahead of ours. So it's just our future, but on a different planet. And that planet you can leave. In fact, you have to. Based on the book, you have to leave that planet after so many years. You make money, and then you go live on a different planet. You can go back to Earth if you want, or you can go on to one of the luxury planets. So that Zenith learns that that's just a planet, and you can. And he's known of planets because he was in a crystal sphere with multiple planets, so he understands that. But then he was told about what a galaxy is, and fully understood the breadth of what he had never understood before. He has understood planetary systems, but a galaxy, learning about a galaxy, even to him, was mind-blowing. And he learned that Proton was just in one. Proton was just a planet among hundreds of thousands. And you go to phase, and it's just essentially this. And, I don't want to give too much away from the book, but phase really isn't a planet. It's more of a plane. And I don't mean a plane of existence, but it is more of a plane. And it's very fascinating, which is why technically you can't leave phase. Even when Zeta had thought about it and tried to get perspective, like, hey, I want to go take a look at something, he would try to fly up. And it's not like he would hit a dome or anything, but he could fly, but there would just be a point to where he would kind of just not be able to continue to fly up. Like there almost just wasn't an up to continue flying. So again, it's not like he just stopped, and it's not like he hit anything, but the concept of going up was almost not there. And he and the main character did a lot to practice with this, eventually obviously learning how he got in and eventually learning to get out. But this is where we come down to why his crystal sphere is so unique. Because of this anomaly, because this sphere got connected with this anomaly, it got distorted. And because by going through this anomaly, you're on phase, which is in of itself its own like plane and not quite an actual planet. But being connected to an entire galaxy, because if you go to Proton and then leave, you can go all over. So with that, took a lot of figuring out, but this anomaly, essentially, instead of being a planet inside the crystal sphere, phase isn't a planet. Phase is flat, and basically, phase is flat, whereas Proton is an actual planet. Phase is flat, but phase is also a mirror image of Proton, so it's very weird to wrap your head around, but it's a plane of existence. You can't go around it. You just go straight until you've gone all the way around, which is why it's an anomaly in the crystal sphere of Zenith's world, because when you go there, it's not a planet to look at, so it's literally nothingness, but you have to learn basically... in a way to think about it, the way he had to do it is you have to learn how to become 2D. In a sense, it's almost like that. It's almost as if you wanted to jump into a painting, so you would have to learn how to become two-dimensional. It kind of like that, but it's not a two-dimensional world. It's just you have to learn how to phase shift in a certain way to even get onto Proton or onto phase. And then from there you can go to Proton, and then from there you can go through a galaxy. So the fact is in the book series, you find out that the planets have their little mimics. And at one point, it was believed that even Earth had its little mimic and could be transitioned, which is why Earth had so much lore of magic and all of that. That's kind of how the book explains that. But what Zenith found out is that similar to how Proton's a planet and has a line cut through, and phase is a plane, but that same line cuts through phase as well, so they're mimics of each other, even though they're not the same shape. Zenith deduced that High Point, his crystal sphere, is the same concept, just another layer. Meaning that even though this one point, this anomaly to get into phase is the only way to then get into Proton, his crystal sphere is essentially the phase version of our galaxy. So, in essence, the reason his crystal sphere is so big is because it's connected to phase, which is connected to Proton, which is the size of which is connected to our galaxy. And therefore, because our galaxy is essentially mirrored through phase, even though you can't go into space in phase, the bubble that phase technically encompasses is the size of our galaxy because it's a mirror of our galaxy. It's just its representation is only on that one planet, but that's where when it transitioned into the D&D world, a crystal sphere was created to encompass it. So that's why I'm able to explain the size and breadth of High Point and why it basically can be endless on that aspect, because the crystal sphere is abnormally large due to the fact that it's literally trying to encompass the mirror image of an entire galaxy that's only represented by a single planet. So I don't know if that makes sense to you guys. I hope it does. But yeah, it's kind of like, again, like the concept of a TARDIS, where the TARDIS, the representation is, like tiny, but the reality of what it is and what's inside of it is much bigger. So that's kind of why High Point has so much opportunity. So rolling through that, he's able to finally work with the main character to get off of phase. And with his help, he even, after a while, goes back, invites the main character to his world, and finds a way to make a traveling ship similar to a Spelljammer that allows the main character to go from phase into High Point. And that comes into play later because he was part of some of the Great Wars, and he's actually a major NPC in the current phase, in the current phase of High Point, in High Point now. But he does reoccur a couple times, and this is a place that people can go. It is a part of kind of the main story, especially if people ever want to advance themselves in certain ways. I think right now Kage with his Doft character is the closest. He's actually talking to, so I keep saying the main character. So the main character of the book is the NPC that I'm talking about, that Zenith has been dealing with. Kage is actually talking to a version of that NPC right now, a version that exists in High Point, kind of like a simulated version that was left behind on a ship. So it is that character, but it's a simulated version from that snapshot of time. So he's talking with that character. And that ship eventually, through the storyline, that ship is basically designed. It was waiting for one person, and when that person arrives, it will take them to phase. It's like the only way, unless you know Zenith, unless Zenith can help you make the transition, this ship is the only way to get to phase, and it's waiting for a very specific passenger. No one knows who that passenger is yet, but Kage's character Dovd knows that there is a passenger being waited for. So once he left phase and came back with all of this new knowledge and all of this concept, and again being taught now what a real galaxy is from a non-magic point of view, Zenith got to work creating High Point. And from here is when the prophecies started, it just even began, because in the book series that that Phase and Proton are from, the prophecy is also a big deal. And I like the concept of prophecies. They're really fun to play with. So the fact that prophecies came from multiple different sources really was able to bring to light the idea that everything Zenith does from here on out, I really wanted to start tying together for long-term stuff. So once he got to work, this is where I officially start counting the eras of High Point. So everything before this was pre-High Point. Once he comes back from phase and begins work on High Point, this is where the main phases of High Point begin. We have the first phase, which was essentially the phase of creation, and that essentially leads to the first Great War, which is some call it the War of Creation, but most call it the War of Power. And essentially, the War of Power was my early stages of D&D or DMing, where I was just kind of like flying off the seat of my pants. I had a loose understanding of the rules, My storytelling was mainly just that. It was more for the storytelling, and I really wanted my players to have fun. Rule of Cool ran everything, and I just let a lot of stuff happen. And even in the way that I personally let the world develop, I realized I was giving too much to too many things and not really balancing it out enough. So I started to play with that idea, and I was like, okay, well, let's be honest. Like, if I really was going to let the world run this way, what would happen? And just like I thought, you think about it, you give too much power to too many people, and there's an imbalance. So Zenith basically had to come down. There were a couple parties that were basically starting to get rowdy enough to want to basically mutiny and go against him. So there was a war of power, and essentially it was a war of power that Zenith had to rebalance because he gave too much power out, and a couple of the creatures that he gave power to, or the new entities, as autonomous as he was trying to make them, they learned how to abuse the unlimited power and become almost powerful enough to take him on. So a war of power ensued, those that followed Zenith and those that were against him. And with this, Zenith realized that he needed to... he was also learning the understanding of what power is. This is where, mantles and the ancients and the Eternals all start to come into play for him. And that is where the war of power really is, when he decided to make more of a structure of things. So this is where he started to assign a structure to his godhoods, his immortals, and really started to hold accountability, right? It wasn't just people holding power, it was holding power and responsibility. So this new era was a little bit more balanced, but it wasn't quite fine-tuned enough. He got all of the higher level stuff, and now, the mortal plane was starting to fill out, and it still wasn't quite what he wanted. It still wasn't organized the way he wanted. So he needed to get things in order before order took over. And essentially what that means is, again, when you have things like Eternals, when you have things like Mantles, and you have things like Prophecies, certain things are bound to happen. He wanted to, ice is going to melt. A glacier will melt. It will create a river. But what you do before the melt can dictate what type of river you're going to run into, right? And where it's going to go. And that's what he wanted to understand, is things are going to unfold. And he started understanding the complexities of that. And so he needed to start dealing with his creations in different ways. So the second era was him setting up for a better organization and how to better balance the world to make sure that the inevitable was going to be in as much control as possible. And with this, he had intentionally / inadvertently started the next Great War, which is essentially considered the War of the Fallen. And by this, it's considered the War of the Fallen because really this shows not only Zenith's true nature as a true neutral party, but it also showed his resolve to do what needs to get done. Depending on who you talk to, a lot of people got backstabbed that day. Others look at it as the inevitable. Others look at it as the right thing to have been done. It's the great part about it. But the War of the Fallen basically began because of choices that Zenith decided that he needed to make, because if he didn't, they were going to be made for him. And what that meant was that he wanted, his whole goal was he wanted everybody to be amenable. He wanted all of his creations. He wanted those in power, the other entities in power, to work with him. He wanted everyone to work together. And he wanted it to be a voluntary thing because he knew that regardless, they weren't really going to have a choice. So it would be better if they were on board with it. Some people were great. Some people weren't. Some people were, going to rebel against it regardless, and some were all for it. And I'm going to keep some details of this under wraps because a lot of this is great in-game lore. That is actually a lot of the motivations for some gods, and coming out in-game and learning it in-game is going to be more impactful to some people. But essentially, Zenith got everyone together, tried to explain the concept of the Eternals, of mantles, of some of the prophecies, and the inevitability, and he did his best to present it as a choice. Now, not everybody believes it was actually a choice, but Zenith gave everyone the choice. Some chose it, some did not, and he knew that was going to be inevitable, but Zenith was smart. He understood the prophecies in a way that the rest didn't, and so he let some things just go the course that they were supposed to, but others he knew that he had to push a little bit harder. And sometimes that meant killing two birds with one stone. And that's exactly what he did. The thing that kicked off the War of the Fallen was he finally came to one of his creations, one of his entities, one of the first. The very first entities, I'll do this in a different, or I'll talk about these in a different episode, but the very first entities he ever created, he called the Saints. These were the most powerful. These were his original creations, the very first that separated from him, so they weren't just his puppets. They were the first entities to be given their own autonomy. And these were the ones that he was trying to give the choices to. Because again, they were the ones that he wanted to be at the top. He wanted their help because they were the ones that had gotten High Point up to here. So it came down to one of his saints, one of the favorites, and one of the most loyal to him. And of course, he gave this one a choice, and this one graciously, without question, dutifully accepted, with a smile, with open arms, with love. And as great of an offer as it sounded, because it was one of the best offers that he could that to anyone, he offered basically a place to his and everyone else's favorite, to the greatest of the saints, the strongest of the saints, the most beautiful of the saints. He offered the greatest opportunity, the most powerful position, one that technically could even be considered rivaling his own position in terms of power. The most important position of all. Even more important than Zenith himself, being the ruler of the realm, the creator of the realm. This position was so much more important that it could only be done by the best. But at the same time, it was the guaranteed only position that had to be taken fully, accepted fully. It could not be given, and it would not be forced. The only way that this mantle could be fully fulfilled was someone to be full-heartedly accepting. And the favorite was, of course, absolutely. And by accepting this position, the fallout of accepting this position was, or I shouldn't say the fallout, the what's the word I'm looking for? I'm blanking here. It's getting late into the stream. Essentially, the requirement, the unfolding, what really meant, what happened by taking this mantle, what really was the actual requirement, the sacrifice, to take this position. That is essentially what is very big up for debate, even now, to this day, in the godhood. The way that it was presented to this saint and the consequences of the acceptance is still hotly debated among the gods today on whether it was fair, on whether it was justifiable. But when that saint accepted the offer, essentially, from everybody else's point of view, that saint ceased to exist. As far from their point of view, as far as all of the other saints were concerned, their brother was gone, poofed out of existence, no longer around. They all felt that loss. Some understood, and some took that loss in stride, and some took that loss with pride and with love. And others took that loss very, very harsh. In fact, so harshly, one in particular person, one of the saints in particular, Zenith knew was going to take it the hardest. Just as much as he knew that his favorite would accept the offer. And this was the two birds with one stone. This is how Zenith had to work. Zenith knew the future was coming. He knew what needed to be done. And he knew that this was the best choice, whether or not it was the right thing to do. It was the best choice. And so he knew by offering to the one person he knew would not say no, the effect it had on another saint would guarantee they adopt the mantle that he needed them to adopt, that they had previously declined. And the problem is Zenith would not normally be one to go against someone's true wishes. But Zenith knew, unfortunately, that he was destined for this mantle. And not that there wasn't any other option, but there were no better options. To not have him take this mantle now would have caused too much disruption, and in the end he would end up having to take the mantle anyway, hence the prophecy issue. So with that, Zenith devised a way to basically make the transition as easy as possible by guaranteeing one would accept, and by that acceptance the other would fall victim to the other mantle. And that moment, that exact moment of acceptance, when the favorite accepted the new mantle and ceased to exist, and the other mantle took over the other saint in that exact moment, that is what kicked off the War of the Fallen. All of the saints in that action immediately were divided. Those for Zenith, those against Zenith, and those that were just done with the whole process. Those that just left. That war is what created, and again, this is part of Zenith's plan, that war is what created the pantheon of gods that we know now. The way that the godhood is organized and structured in High Point as of right now in modern time all stemmed from the War of the Fallen. This is what created all of the bonds, the allies, the alliances, the treaties, the nemesis, the rivalries, the blood pacts, just everything. All of it was created during this war. And the War of the Fallen is just really what created the pantheon and allowed for the existence of the mortal world to really flourish, because without the pantheon of gods, the mortal world wasn't in balance. And this is what Zenith needed. He needed a balanced flow of power and organization before the mortal world could really flourish. And then we are brought to the mortal world. So after all of that, after things settled down as much as they could, and the mortal world began to flourish, all of these new gods, of course, needing followers, all of these new gods wanting to flex their power, build their own creations, set forth out into this empty expanse. Because by this point, Zenith came out of phase, started creating his own world along with the saints. And then during the War of Creation, or the War of Power, a lot of stuff was destroyed in spite or strategically, and then they had to rebuild a lot of the galaxy, And then the War of the Fallen happened. A lot more got destroyed, but also a lot got created in the process. And also keep in mind that, a lot of the first things during the War of Power were just being popped into creation by pure magic, which is another reason why Zenith had to stop that. He needed certain things to be created over time. So the War of Power destroyed a lot, and so did the War of the Fallen. But during those times, we're talking about godhood here. These were eons that were passing. So all of that destruction, whenever gods would create things and the other gods would destroy them, like literal planets would just be shattered. This is where you're starting to get the galactic matter. And this is how I explain how High Point has become a galaxy, is all of those things the gods were creating and destroying. There was no use for them to regain all of the minute little bits of it. So they would just let it float in the abyss. And again, mimicking our galaxy, bits and pieces would start to coalesce in areas that they were drawn to for one reason or another, which is why, you start to get more areas and more organization. So gods are still able to pop things in and out of existence, but the universe itself is also coalescing with gases and matter and unique matter that these gods are creating, which is why I also find it fun that you can go across planets that are made of very unique items, or why planets can have minerals that we've never heard of before, like in the real world, and why this explains it in the D&D concept, because you're literally having gods that have too much power, that are flaunting that power, that are pushing the bounds of their power, creating things that quite literally are unnatural and should never and could never exist. And then through chaos, those bits and pieces are being thrown across the universe, coalescing into their own planets, into their own materials, and now you have High Point as it is. Some planets still created by the gods themselves, which makes for great lore and great story building. But then you have all of these other things that you can justify. Why can you find a material that's, or a gem that seems to be the existence of diamond and gold, but not diamond in gold or gold inside diamond, but a diamond gold material that is the two somehow coexisting simultaneously? That would be a god level creation from way back when that over all of the cataclysms has morphed and changed into that material, right? So that's another reason why I like this backstory, is because it helps me explain a lot more in the world. So as the mortal world starts to build, as planets start to form, as the gods start to do their own thing, of course, the mortal world begins to grow and have its own, internal issues. And then, of course, you have gods that are, creating their own versions of mortals, their own creatures. They have followers, they have religions. And now you have a new type of war of power. You have all of these gods who had the taste of mass power and then kind of got put in their place. But now they're the sphere, they have their own spheres of influence, right? They have their own areas of power. And now they're trying to do exactly what they did before. They're going to abuse that power through these mortals. And eventually you get to the point where the mortals started getting too much power. During the War of Power and the War of the Fallen, you also had all of these god-level mighty weapons being created that were now in the hands of mortals. And now you had mortals being able to rival and challenge immortals and some of the gods because of the things that, the gods were not paying attention to. They were not, keep in mind, all of these phases aren't just for story. They're not just for me to say all of this. A lot of these stories are also representing how I used to run the realm. So I used to let a lot of way more high-powered shit through. And this is kind of why I talk about it or why I talk about it in the sense of this story is all the things that I was allowing my players to do and allowing my NPCs to do kind of would lead to all of these OP things happening and all these OP weapons. So the gods were like, hey, we gotta push back on this. Like these, the mortals are becoming too much. There's too much imbalance of power down there. They're starting to rival us, and we just got our balance of power up here. So then you have the third great war of my realm, which is the War of the Mages. And essentially, this is when the biggest issue is kind of a twofold war. It's called the War of the Mages from the mortal point, because at this point, there were so many people who were so powerful in magic, they started to get, not only were they challenging the gods, but they were starting to get together and saying, hey, kind of like the wealthy, right? They were like, hey, we're the most powerful. Why don't we just keep all the power and stop other people? So they were essentially trying to hoard it and shut power off from everybody else. And Zenith wasn't about that. Zenith is not about to let a world without power, or power being like, that was his whole deal, right? So he wasn't about to allow that. A lot of the gods that were, realizing that these guys were doing this, not only were they trying to shut off power from the mortals, but they realized that if they had all the power, they basically should be about as powerful as the gods. So that's where you had this twofold war coming from. It's called the War of the Mages, but that's just because from the point of view, everybody was fighting against the mages to literally have access to magic across the board instead of only having it held by a few people. So that war was really interesting because it basically did two things. On the mortal realm, it helped spread out a lot of the magic usage, not only the magic items and the knowledge of magic, but it allowed for a more magic to be created. So this was also back when I was using just the books version and the old versions of magic from like 2nd edition. This is now when I started to add on other editions and started adding my own magic to the world, like we've talked about before, which is still written on my board from like 2 months ago. But yeah, all of that was now starting to be added. So magic was being spread, but in order to not be so able to be controlled, what they did was they basically divided up the magic. So being smart about it, the only reason why people were able to hoard the magic is because there was only a few types and there was only a few ways to use it. And it was really, really easy to just hoard all of the major powerful items. So a couple of different phases happened. Magic was spread out into more versions, more types of magic, more ways to access the weave were created, essentially, is what we're talking about. The magical items were dispersed more evenly. Some were destroyed, so that magic could then go into other things. And this is also when all of the, War of Power and War of the Fallen items, like the really, really powerful, like game-changing, like world-breaking items, were eventually stored away. Now, where they were stored is actually kind of fun because some were stolen by other gods and they're stored away in private vaults. There were a couple god tier vaults that were created and stored a lot of these things. One such one was created actually by the main character from the other book. When I said that he would come and be part of some of these wars, he actually was part of all 3 wars. His help was needed because, again, he was helping Zenith with this new universe as well. And one of his vaults is actually a main plot point currently for a lot of my characters, because whenever he comes, the main character from that book series, whenever he comes to High Point, he actually started going by the name King Septim. So that was his title, his NPC name when he came here. He had a couple others in different forms, like when he would come into like immortal form. He also has a god version. But when he was whenever he presented himself as immortal, he was King Septim. And he has a vault full of stuff. And there's also a couple interesting ideas where there was ships that used to have a bunch of sentient items been sunken. And there was like a really, really big one. It was like a Spelljammer ship that was supposed to basically take a whole bunch and it was kind of like the idea of a time capsule. Maybe one day these weapons will be useful, but we're going to send them away for now. Well, that Spelljammer ship ended up crashing during one of the wars into a deep part of just kind of crashed in some deep water. Was never really recovered because no one ever, it was basically hidden by magic, so no one knew where it was. But I used that as some lore to kind of spawn the siren race, a specific type of siren race, because I like the idea that, this warded up Spelljammer ship over time would decay, and all of those magical sentient items trying to work together to be free. I like the idea of like the hull kind of like cracking just enough to where a little bit of magic can come out. And so instead of the magical items being freed, the idea is their magical auras were so powerful in leaking out of this damaged ship over time that those essences became like the aura that draws people, like the cursed items that draws people in. Those essentially became apparitions, and those around the sunken ships would essentially become what sailors would know as sirens, because these apparitions would try to draw them in. And really what it is it's the aura of like cursed items and other magical items trying to draw adventurers and draw people into using them. And the representation of that is like the sirens, like the calls in the sea, the apparitions that you can see trying to drown you, but in reality they're just trying to bring you down to a ship. So other options to where if people were to go and search, why those sirens are in certain locations, you'd end up being able to find a broken spelljammer ship with a whole bunch of high-powered shit that could kill the world. So yeah, just a little sprinklings. And again, this is why I like. Again, I always have an excuse for everything, or not an excuse, I have a reason for everything. And this is why I like doing these really deep backstories for the realm, because I can tie in all of the different options. If someone wants to go travel on the seas, they're going to run into these siren creatures of mine. And if they could either just ignore them, but if you do eventually push and push and push and try to figure out what's really going on, you're going to eventually find out that these sirens are coming from a deep, deep sunken ship. And if you can finally break in, you're going to find a bunch of awesome weapons from way, way back in the day. But they're not easy to find, right? They're not just campaigns I'm going to put anybody on. But anyway, so the final war, the War of the Mages, was primarily a mortal matter. Just basically a bunch of mortals banding together to fight against these high-powered mages that were basically, essentially this is where a lot of those mages, like the liches in my world, are those mages, like the mages that were trying to hoard power. A lot of them became liches, either before or during or after the War of the Mages. So everyone revolted against the mages. Immortals came down to help. Gods were coming down to help because they were, not happy with, the mortals having too much power and starting to challenge them. And that's where we have all of the different ways of accessing the weave, because the more ways you have to access the weave, the harder it is to hoard magic. That allowed for more balancing and dispersion amongst the mortal world, and it allowed for the gods to essentially confirm their position and maintain their power and balance everything out, because more gods became more aware of their job and realized, oh yeah, if I don't do my job of balancing the universe and I'm not paying attention to my sphere of influence, shit goes awry. So it's also where a lot of the godhood, a lot of the pantheon of gods really, before in the War of the Fallen, that's how we got the pantheon. The War of the Mages, because of the uprising of the mages into the godhood and because of the balancing on the mortal realm, it's really what made a lot of the gods understand what their positions are, really made them more made their resolve in their areas more important. And it didn't necessarily wipe the slate clean. It's not like the rivalry stopped, but they understood that, balance before personal, retribution. So there's still rivalries, there's still stuff going on, but first and foremost, it's their responsibility to gather their followers, make sure that the balance that they control is in balance, and then go fuck with somebody else's balance. And that's where we are now. That right now, High Point is basically riding on that. Those are the three great wars. If you ever hear me mention them, the three great wars that led to where we're at with High Point. And essentially all of that is information that's gameable and findable in game. You can find out so much more gaming with me or talking with me on, just meta stuff. But that's like those are like the major highlights, I think, of what brought High Point to where it is now. And we're on a major tipping point right now. In fact, High Point, the way it's been going, is at a potentially fourth major turning point. It's not guaranteed, but there are things happening in the realm with all of my players, and depending on the choices that they make, it could very well lead to another fourth major turning point. Essentially, something that's kind of always been in the background is that there is an entity out there trapped away that was deemed too dangerous to be let out. This entity has been around since the beginning. Zenith always intended for him to be here, but he always understood that he was very dangerous, And especially if Zenith didn't have everything really on point, this entity could unravel everything he's ever done. So because he's neutral, he decided that this entity should have a chance at life, should have a chance to be here, has every right to, but is too dangerous to have had from the very beginning available. So from the beginning, this entity has been trapped away and can only be let out, hopefully, when it's time and when Zenith is strong enough and has everything balanced and secure enough to where this entity can't disrupt, destroy, or uproot everything. And this entity is himself. After he ascended and left, he left part of himself behind as a decoy in the old realm, and just so hopefully his emperor would never come find him. I mean, obviously the emperor wouldn't be able to, because he'd have to go through the crack, do all the same things, and then somehow find this crystal sphere. But Zenith always just thinks of that, and he's like, hey, if I leave a piece of myself behind who doesn't know anything about this, everything will look fine. But Zenith never forgot how he became a god. And he became a god because I made a character, my very first D&D character. I gamed my ass off. I worked my ass off to never die and to excel to the point of becoming a god. And Zenith always knew, and even after he became a god, Zenith never gave up on that mortal life. Once he became a god, he immediately created an avatar of Dice, essentially from that exact moment, and basically continued to let Dice go, because his mindset was Dice was able to become a god. I'm a god because of him. Now, granted, this is also when Zenith decided to become true neutral, which Dice is not. So he did become, and with all of the knowledge that he was given about like everything in creation, he wasn't the same person. He could not continue to be Dice on a god tier. But if Dice could become a god, imagine what else he could do if he was able to continue. And that's his mindset. So when I first became a god with this character, I immediately allowed Dice to continue as immortal. So when Zenith did all of this and he finally came to his own place, he had that thought of, imagine what Dice could do here. Imagine what I could do if I still was that person. And as he was creating his world, he, being true neutral, also felt that Dice belonged here. He wouldn't be here without Dice, and imagine what Dice could do. But he also knew what Dice could do. And that terrified him, because if he wasn't ready, he knew unleashing Dice on an incomplete world would uproot it and very much destroy it. So he decided that Dice would be able to be here, but he wouldn't be able to be fully free until things were ready. So Dice is locked away, but part of the prophecy indicates not that he will return, but the prophecy indicates that he has a chance to return. And that's kind of where the current era of things are right now. Based on what all of the characters do in all of the different gaming groups I have, will depend on whether or not Dice is released. And if he is, if you were here for my deep dive in the Discord that I made a couple years ago, if you want to rewatch that on YouTube, MisfitGamersStudios, by the way, if you want to go rewatch that series, I do talk a lot about where and when that takes place. Now, that is an alternate future. That Discord, that campaign took place in an alternate future, and that alternate future is the reason why. And I explained this before, but the reason why I did it in an alternate future was I wanted my veteran gamers that were currently developing this campaign, I wanted them to kind of see what it would be like. I wanted to drive home the importance of their actions. So the whole point of that was they were going to game through and eventually enter a place that was going to have like a lot of artifacts from the past that caused that future, because that future was going to be a lot darker, a lot more evil than the current gameplay that we have. And they were going to discover why. And through that, they were going to go to this place that has a bunch of archived stuff. And what they were supposed to do is they were going to find a bunch of items there that, even though the characters that they were playing wouldn't know anything about, they were supposed to be items for the players to recognize. Maybe their weapon from a certain character they had, or an artifact that they had discovered during one of their campaigns. And the idea was that this archive was going to tell a story, and it was going to reference certain situations that their other characters were either currently in or had alluded to will be in, or would allude to NPCs that those other characters knew and that either succeeded or failed at something. And the idea was basically going to paint a story that this dark, evil future that technically they didn't know, but was actually the future where Dice comes back and takes over and actually overthrows Zenith as the leading god. That future is directly tied to choices that they have a chance to make. And that was the big reveal that they were supposed to get, is they were supposed to get to this archive, see all these things, and the players were supposed to have that eureka moment of, oh, I could lead to this. And then when they come back to the normal thing, it was kind of just to vibe them up, to get them realizing, like, yeah, your guys' shit matters. Every choice you make matters to the future of this realm. So they got to see what a dice-controlled evil future looks like. And it was also a way for me to play with some of the hype, some 5th edition mechanics for High Point. But essentially, yeah, Zenith Dice is still locked up somewhere, and we are coming up to potentially seeing his revival. And if he is released, that would mark we've had 3 great wars, and so we're essentially in, let's see, so if we had the time it was, then a war, then another war, then the time. So yeah, we're in the 4th era, essentially. 3 great wars have led to the 4th era, and we're coming up to potentially the 4th major epoch into the 5th era, if Dice is released. And if he's not released, that leads to a different epoch, to a different 5th era. But yeah, that's... I'm actually happy with that description. That right there is the origin of High Point. I think that actually covers a lot of the goodies of High Point. There's still a lot to cover in terms of, like, just the current stage of things. But yeah, I think that covers a lot of the path Zenith took, finding himself as a god locked away in a nothing prison, finding a way out, getting to traverse some of the history of D&D himself, and the history of the realms, and being able to discover his own through the help of the ancient gods or the older gods, and finally coming across a place to call his own that he himself now had to go through the trials and tribulations of learning how to control, through trial and error. And I like it. I like what I've built. I like the story. And like I said, I did a lot of it not just because I wanted that story, and not just because I liked the idea of being able to have a story behind my realm, but it really tracks with a couple things. One, it tracks directly along with the research I was doing to become a better DM and learning about D&D and the history that it's had. But it also tracks with me being able to set up all the things I wanted to see in my realm, but that I wanted a reason for. So by doing this very complex story, I'm able to link all of the activities and all of the things that I want in my current realm. It directly tracks with a reasoning and an origin since the beginning. And 3, I really like it because it gives me something to work off of, to give the players to work something off of. I can create a town, I can create a situation, but having a living world like this, that I'm giving Zenith these emotions, these feelings, these drives, I'm giving the Saints, their own motivations. It makes it easier for me to make the world feel livable. It makes it feel like it's more of a evolving thing. And with all of that, it makes it easier because also kind of like my note system, right? It's hard to keep track of how things are going to progress when you're running, a realm that's multiple planets, essentially the size of a galaxy. But when you have such rich story like this, it's easier to keep track of who's doing what and why. because you have those major bullet points. You have those things that are keeping them in line and keeping them on pace with their with their character development. So thank you for being here. Thank you for sticking with me as I walked you through the origins of High Point. I hope that was interesting. I hope not too difficult to understand. If y'all have any questions for me or about High Point, about the history or anything, join us on Discord. Join me on my Discord. And definitely come in and ask. You can either let me know if you want me to answer it on stream, or you can just ask in the Discord itself, and I would be happy to answer, just there live. We're trying to build the community. We're trying to get some ideas for what you guys want to hear us talk about, and we just want to hear how you guys game. So come on and join the Discord. Let us know what's going on. It is like a 3-step verification process. Accept the rules. Hit the check mark to verify with the bot, and then post your stream or your Twitch name. That's all we got to do, and then we'll get you in. We want to hear from you. If you have homebrew ideas that you want to hear us review on Mondays, submit those as well. If you did like what you saw here today, if you missed anything, or if you want to catch any of the previous streams, you can catch everything that we've done on YouTube at MisfitGamersStudios. Or if you want to catch me again, every Monday and Thursday at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, I do D&D discussions. On Mondays, I'm joined by my co-host Kage, where we discuss everything D&D. And then on the weekends, I will do pop-up games where I play a lot of different RPGs that just remind me of D&D, and we just do some fun pop-up games. So if you see me live, pop in and say hi. I did just re-download Dead by Daylight. Not quite an RPG, but because it's the spooky season, I think I might try my hand at Killer. I've only played for like 2 hours before and then gave up. So I might be doing a couple dives of that. I also play Shadows of Doubt, which is a really fun detective game. I'm doing a nice run of Baldur's Gate. Another one of my buddies and I are doing an evil run of Baldur's Gate. And I started playing Cyberpunk on stream as well. So those are kind of what I'm doing. If you're new, catch me on the weekends for those gameplays. Again, if you like the D&D stuff, Mondays and Thursdays, or go ahead and join the Discord. I really appreciate you all joining me tonight. Hope you had a fun time. Hope you enjoyed the rest of your week and that you have a great weekend. I'm Vortex. I'm out of here. I hope you guys have a good rest of your night.